Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm of course your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 254th episode, our guest is Dr. Donna J. Nicol. Dr. Donna J. Nicol is the Associate Dean of Personnel and Curriculum in the College of Liberal Arts and a Professor of History at California State University, Long Beach. She is the immediate past department chair and professor of Africana Studies at CSU Dominguez Hills, a post she held from 2017 to 2023. She earned her doctorate degree in educational studies with a specialization in history and philosophy of higher education and a graduate minor in African American and African Studies from The Ohio State University in 2007. Dr. Nicol's research focuses race, conservative philanthropy, and U.S. higher education and the history of African American women's educational activism. Her work has been published in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, The Feminist Teacher, twice, History of Philanthropy, Palimpsest, a Journal of Women, Gender, and the Black International, the Encyclopedia of American Women's History, Encyclopedia of Multiracial America, and Habitus of the Hood. In February 2021, Dr. Nicol was a featured guest expert for the Al Jazeera English documentary, The Big Picture, A Race for America. Dr. Nicol has also published opinion columns on racism in philanthropy for Al Jazeera Digital and has appeared on the Insufferable Academics podcast, the Fresh Off the Vote podcast, and the Peace and Justice radio show. Prior to becoming an academic, Dr. Nicol spent 3 years teaching secondary language arts and social studies for the Los Angeles Unified School District and 7 years in various academic administrative roles at Mount St. Mary's College and The Ohio State University. She serves on the board of directors for the Historical Society of Southern California, co-principal investigator for the State of Black Los Angeles County Report 2023, and is active in a number of professional, academic, and social service organizations. Her latest book, Black Woman on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action, was published May 7th by the University of Rochester Press. A quick editor's note. Since we recorded this episode, Donald Trump agreed to debate Kamala Harris on ABC News on September 10th. And now on to the show.
I kind of discovered this woman, Claudia Hampton, who was the first Black female trustee in the Cal State system, kind of by having a digital archive about an organization my grandmother created, and stumbled across this photograph of this woman. And the photograph was her in regalia, doctoral regalia, behind a podium at a grand. And what really struck me was that it said at the bottom of the photo, appointed by Ronald Reagan. And that just struck me as odd because knowing Ronald Reagan's history, particularly when he was governor of California, he wasn't very supportive of civil rights and African Americans in particular pursuing social justice. And so I was intrigued by that. And I had written about Reagan once he became president in my research on conservative philanthropy. So I was just curious. And so out of that really came an interest to know more about this woman. And as luck would have it, the CSU, the Cal State System Archives, is located at Cal State Dominguez Hills, which was local to me. And so I just kind of went through whatever they had, and at the bottom of a box was a 6-hour interview done with Claudia Hampton, where she talks about how she got appointed onto the board and the things that she had done up to that point, which was about 10 years into her board service. And so the book, what really made me interested in writing this book wasn't simply because she was the first Black trustee, although that was interesting to me. What was important to me was the fact that we did not know, and the general public doesn't know, what trustees do. And I found myself, even though I worked in the system for many years as a faculty member, I graduated from 2 Cal States for undergrad and my master's degree, I didn't know much about the trustees and the power they wield over educational policy and admissions and so forth. And so what it ended up becoming was a discovery for me, and then wanting to share with the public, what do trustees or governors of boards or regents, what do they actually do, and how much power do they have over the running of the institution?
Right. So how much power do they have and what do they do?
Yeah, so they have their original charge is oversight. They're to just pretty much do a kind of check and balance to make sure that uh, universities, particularly public universities, are managing the funds that are given by the state government. So they're making sure that they're not overspending or spending on things that don't align with the purpose of the institution. Um, but they have more power than just to do oversight. They're appointed by governors, so that in and of itself means that a lot of times they're patronage type of positions for people who gave, contributions to a governor's campaign, or some kind of friend to the governor. Because of that, having that relationship, that close relationship to the governor, means that uh, they have a lot more control over an institution rather than the university president, who is the visible face of top administration or top leadership. But the trustees or the boards of regents or the governors actually dictate what the parameters by which the president can operate. So they have control over hiring decisions, firing decisions. In the Cal State system, they have control over the curriculum. Every 5 years or 7 years, academic departments have to go through program review, and they have to submit them to the trustees. The trustees can give funding to student groups. They could pull the funding away. In the case of Cal State Fullerton, which is one of the campuses in the system, there was a controversial article that was written in the campus newspaper, and the trustees were upset about how they were presented, and so they pulled funding temporarily. So we assume that, universities have academic freedom and faculty can kind of do what they want, but that's not really the case.
Right. This book is kind of an interesting look at the phenomenon of affirmative action too, because obviously the her rise is correlated with that.
Mhm.
Could you just give a small overview of kind of the history of affirmative action in this case, and maybe in a wider context that people might be more already familiar with?
Yes, so affirmative action started as an executive order by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, and it was designed to address historic discrimination and exclusion of groups. Originally, it was supposed to be limited to federal contracting. So any type of federal job that you might get would have affirmative action attached to it. Um, Now, affirmative action means that employers are going to take an extra step to recruit people who have been historically excluded. Uh, and so it's different than non-discrimination, which says that you can't bar someone because of their race or their gender or their national origin. So those are two, they're connected, but they're different things. But in 1972, a number of feminist groups, in particular one named the Women's Equity Action League, uh, were upset that affirmative action, though women were included in the second iteration of affirmative action, which was in 1967, the federal government didn't have any kind of instructions for how to implement affirmative action. So they passed the policy, but they didn't pass any instructions. And so these groups started to file complaints that there weren't any kind of implementation mechanism particularly applied to the university. And so by 1972, the federal government under the Health, Education, and Welfare Office issued a new set of rules which mandated universities to apply affirmative action to the hiring of particularly faculty and staff. Most universities waited a little bit later to deal with affirmative action for students. That came later.
Right. And it's an interesting world that she had to move through, right? Because as you said, she was appointed by Ronald Reagan, and there was probably a lot of white conservative men that were, her peers in this. Obviously, being the first is never easy for anybody. But talk a little bit about how she navigated that society, the way it was set up at that time when she came into this world.
Yeah, so she was appointed in 74 by Reagan, and you're right. There was majority of the board were white men, most of them conservative leaning. Um, there were a few white women that were appointed. I think there were three prior to Claudia Hampton being appointed. And in order for her to really navigate in that space, she had to develop some strategies, which I refer to in the book as sly civility. And so sly civility is a resistance strategy that was first coined by cultural theorist Homi Bhabha, which says that when you are able to go into spaces that you are historically excluded from, you need to behave civilly toward those in power, learn their resources, learn about the opportunities, their knowledge, and then slyly pass that on to other marginalized groups or groups that had been historically excluded. And so for Hampton, what she had to do was um, really be prepared when she would go into meetings. She would have to she knew she would have to negotiate with these conservative white men. And so one of the first things that she does is she just observes the board for a year. She really doesn't say much of anything. She's watching to see who's the power players, which who are the trustees that people defer to, and she makes a plan on how she's going to bring them to her side and to show them that she is a political moderate. Because thinking about 1974, we're really in the middle of this kind of black radicalism that kind of dictates the politics. And so for her, she has to show them, I'm not a black radical, I'm actually a black moderate. And eventually what she realizes that is because she has been excluded from their informal network, which they call the telephone network. She needs to get access to this network. And so she decides she is going to start to introduce, or not introduce, but to invite some of the more powerful trustees to her house. And eventually, what happens is that when she's cooking dinner for these men, she becomes accepted into the telephone network. So her entree point into all of this is actually by playing to the gender norm of being a woman and being a hostess to these men so that she can kind of disarm their racism or their race anxiety about her being black. And so that's how she navigates, is that she builds relationships with these white men in informal ways by cooking dinner, by um, sending Christmas cards to their families, by asking about their wives, by going to have a cigarette with them during the breaks. It's not a kind of hit people over your head, you must accept me. It's I'm going to build a relationship with you, a friendship with you, so that you can trust me. And so that's how she moved throughout the board. And it gave her a lot of capital. Uh, and what she calls it is this kind of playing the game of boardsmanship, that in order to move and get things done, she's going to have to find a way to get the conservatives in particular, and there are many of them on this board, she's going to have to let them know that she's safe enough for them to barter with.
Hmm. Right. I just thought that was an interesting point that you were making about that in terms of the conversations we have about respectability politics. I never thought of being casual as white privilege, but it kind of is. You know what I mean? Like, because
Yeah.
I can go out looking a mess and I'm not worried about anything, but it's like I have to like if you're already getting, the side eye, just by existing, it's like you have to look you have to look a little better than, you can't be a mess. So I think that's an interesting tension because ideally I would like everyone to be able to be casual all the time if they felt like it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that would be my ideal, but that's just not the world we live in. But again, that's hard to do. It's hard to afford nice clothes, and it's hard to, look neat and, no stitch out of place all the time. Like it's hard work, and not everybody has the means always to do that. To look as well as they possibly could. So it's a barrier. I see where it comes from, but it's like, gosh, this is such a barrier to entry to like society.
Yeah, yeah. And it's clothing, but it's also your speech and your diction, like you think about Kamala Harris when she's talking to certain audiences, she talks you can hear her inflections are different when
Hmm.
she's speaking to a mostly black and brown audience versus a mostly white audience. She's code switching constantly.
Right.
And she has to do that because she has to make herself safe for those folks who would say, when she made the comment, say it to my face.
Well, Donald, I do hope you'll reconsider to meet me on the debate stage. Because as the saying goes, if you've got something to say it to my face.
You know, some people were, saying like, well, she didn't have to be that aggressive. And it was like, what was aggressive about that?
Right.
But from a black perspective, that was just letting you know, like if you have
Hmm.
something to say about me or to me, I
Hmm.
don't need to hear it from a back channel, say it directly to me.
Sure.
Um, and so Hampton had to make sure the audience that she was dealing with knew that she was safe enough, and that she would not beat them over the head with charges of racism.
Hmm.
And so it's respectability politics, though, there is a lot of discussion about the harms that respectability have. To your point, like, why can't I dress casually and still be taken seriously?
Right.
But respectability makes it possible for you to engage in sly civility behavior.
Hmm.
And if you have no power, there's only a few means by which you can gain power. And, the white men on the board had blunt power. They could close out a whole program and no one would really question it. But with Claudia Hampton, she's trying to gain resources. So she has to gain favor first in order to gain resources.
Well, and you can do a lot more once you're on the inside of something than you can on the outside of it. So,
Yes.
and you can't get inside if, you don't play the game to a certain degree, and it just kind of comes with it. You're not going to get in the door otherwise. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So like, we had the student activists of the 60s and into the 70s. Those students were loud and rancorous and they had every right to be upset and complain about the way in which they were treated or ignored or whatever. But in order for you to actually make change on with these institutions, you have to have somebody on the inside who can translate your anger and hostility from the outside into policy and programs on the inside. So you need both. I think one of the problems that people have is that we get fixed into these either or approaches to making change, but you need the agitation on the outside to let people know people are pissed. then you need somebody on the inside to say, yes, these people are pissed, but this is how we're going to address their concerns.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Skipping forward in the story a little bit, affirmative action comes to an end. And, in your, the timeline of the person you're writing about, of course, it comes to an end for her. But in a larger sense, it's kind of come to an end. I mean, the Supreme Court has pretty much killed it at this point, right? I don't think it exists in any substantive way anymore. Although I feel like having your parents be legacies at Ivy League institutions is kind of affirmative action, but whatever.
Yeah.
We'll leave that
Yeah.
to the side for now. But like the idea of affirmative action, it seemed like a wave that kind of crested, at least in practice, and now it seems like it's totally gone. So how did this all end up in the California system, and I guess in a larger sense?
So usually there had always been backlash against affirmative action from its inception in 65. But then in 78, it was narrowed across the country with the Bakke decision, the University of California versus Bakke decision, which got rid of quotas. So you don't have any more set asides for a particular group in a job or university. When people talk about, oh, my child didn't get into, Harvard University because they set aside a spot for these Black kids or these Latino kids, they're lying because the federal government outlawed that in 78. But then what happened by 1990 is you have the recession, and the recession hastens racial anxiety. And you couple that, and this is what I talk about in the last chapter of the book, is that you take those economic anxieties, and then you take this kind of racist dog whistling that's coming from conservative groups like the Heritage Foundation, like the Madison Center for Educational Affairs. These groups are spending money to not only talk bad about affirmative action, but they're saying, look, you had the Rodney King riot, you had all of these things that have happened. These people are not deserving of affirmative action. So you take like I said, the anxiety about the economics, and then you couple it with a concerted media attack on affirmative action and anything that is type of race-based initiatives, whether it's to help immigrants or whatever the case may be. So those things are coalescing all at the same time, and that hastens California getting rid of affirmative action. We also had Proposition 187, which was a proposition here to not that really targeted Latino and Asian American immigrants and pretty much blaming them for the economic problems of the state. And so Pete Wilson, who was the governor at the time, really, he was about to lose that election. And then he latched on to Proposition 187, and he started using imagery of Mexicans running across the US border with their children and things like that. And so you kind of whip up this kind of fake outrage that blames the immigrant, that blames the person of color, and it deflects from what's happening in terms of our wages are not keeping pace with inflation. And so it's this kind of deflection and misdirection. And so people blame affirmative action for these problems and not the, folks on Wall Street who are depressing your wages.
Mm-hmm.
So affirmative action in California is gone by 96. 5 other states follow in getting rid of affirmative action using the California playbook. If you can get rid of affirmative action in the so-called most liberal state, you can get rid of it anywhere. And then it languished. It stopped for about 5 years, but you started to see I have an article that's called the Affirmative Action the anti-affirmative action industry. And what you start to see are these entrepreneurs who are making money off of trying to get rid of affirmative action. One of them is Edward Blum. He's directly connected to the Supreme Court case that happened in 2023, where they overturned affirmative action in college admissions. Blum has been working kind of unnoticed for decades. He's not a lawyer. He's an entrepreneur who gets paid by the American Enterprise Institute and other groups. And he created a membership organization called Students for Fair Admission. And what he did was he just he basically looks for students who didn't get admitted into the elite universities and say, hey, do you want to file a lawsuit? I'll support you. And it's like, where's his money coming from for him to support people if he's not an attorney? Well, he's getting it from conservative foundations. So like I said, American Enterprise Institute is one of them. Bradley, I believe Scafe's has given him money, and Hickory, there's a couple of others. And so the case that made its way to Harvard is a case that is based on this legal entrepreneur who in a lot of ways falsified his membership rosters, because none of the folks who appeared on Students for Fair Admissions roster were actual students at Harvard University. They were just people who had signed up. All they had to do was pay a $10 membership, and all of a sudden the roles got larger and larger. So he takes this case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically makes the decision, and of course we know it's a split court, and they get rid of admissions, affirmative action in admission. But there's a caveat. All of the military universities or institutions are allowed to continue to have affirmative action, which is really suspicious that you need diversity in the military in order to keep unit cohesion, but you don't want to have diversity where people could actually get the degrees that would be necessary for them to do higher paying white collar jobs. And so I think that given that affirmative action has been more or less cut, the reason why studying the kind of arc of that history is important is so that you can see where you can come up with an alternative. So I think that caveat about we still want affirmative action in military universities opens the door for people to reintroduce a constitutional amendment to bring back affirmative action. The other thing that the book is, what I hope for people to get out of it is to pay attention to what is going to happen to your classrooms, 3, 5, 10 years down the line. So in California, the Black student population cut exactly in half. It was 8%, it went down to 4%. Native American population cut in half as well. The Latinx population did not cut in half because they had population growth. So their population in a 20-year period went from 7% to 15%. Oh, not 15%, 7 million people to 15 million people in a 20-year period. So it more than doubled. But their graduation rates have been stagnant since 2015. So there's getting rid of affirmative action didn't help or hurt the Latinx. Well, it hurt the Latinx population down the road. The other thing that I think is important is that people start to come up with some counter strategies, because people are already over interpreting the Supreme Court decision. Let me explain. There are a number of universities that have race-based scholarships set aside for different racial groups and so forth. A number of conservative groups are trying to go in and say we need to get rid of these race-based scholarships. But if the donor wanted that money to go to a certain population, most universities don't want to turn away donor dollars. And so what do these universities offer to attract, say, students of color if their scholarships for students of color have been obliterated? And what I think is going to have to happen is that universities are going to have to start working with community foundations and start to offer those scholarships through the community foundations, as opposed to uh, capitulating and getting rid of these race-based scholarships on their own. So the implications of what's happened in 2023 is I'm scared for the future of, particularly for public higher education. We already knew private education was pretty exclusionary in terms of students of color and diversity, but the public institutions, they're going to get rocked hard if California is an example.
I guess I'm also very concerned for the future. And will affirmative action ever make a return? Is there a way for it to come back, or is it gone?
I mean, I don't want to say it's gone, but it's going to be a hard climb in order to bring it back. Um, like I said, it would have to be a constitutional amendment, and that is going to require a change in the leadership of the country, but particularly, things like expanding the court or limiting the terms, the term limits on the Supreme Court. But before we even get to the national, states are going to need to wrestle with this issue. Like, if the Supreme Court limits what you can do in terms of admission into the university, the alternative is to go to a thing called holistic review. So holistic review looks beyond the traditional measures to get into the university. So we usually look at SAT scores, we'll look at GPA. Each high school is given a competitiveness ranking. Most people don't know that. But instead of looking at those traditional metrics that are associated with zip codes, we look at things like held a job while they were going to school at the same time. Look at their writing or do an interview with students. There are some universities here in California that have moved to holistic review in order to maintain diversity in the classroom. And so it's going to take a little bit more than, the quadratic equation that they use where they put all of the little numeric variables in and start to move toward a more qualitative based type of admissions. But there are ways, and that has been advocated. Holistic review has been advocated by many groups, that you don't necessarily just stick to SAT scores, because we know that students who are more privileged can go take the SAT prep course, whereas the students who are poor don't have that same access.
Right.
And so go to holistic review so that you can practice equity as opposed to equality.
That's an important distinction. That's a very important word. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Well, there's only a few minutes left in our in our meeting here, but I could ask you about so many more things. But is there anything else about this book that we didn't talk about that you think it's important for people to know?
I think people should know that I really think that people should know that despite people professing a support for affirmative action or support for diversity, there is a difference between putting a policy in place and implementing the policy. And that, I think, hopefully came through in the section of the book that deals with Jerry Brown, who was supposed to be the flamboyant liberal, yet never funded affirmative action until he was pressured and shamed into doing it. And for a myriad of reasons why he did not fund affirmative action, he preferred to fund our college prep programs because they're cheaper to fund rather than affirmative action. Because we think of him as super liberal, but his action said something completely different.
Great. Thank you for taking all this time again. I really appreciate it. One question I do always ask before we go, though, is what music have you been listening to lately?
I have been listening to a guy named Noah Guy.
I don't know that person.
He is out of Philly. He is he's probably 19 or 20, but he sounds much older.
Okay.
So Noah Guy, Guy.
Cool.
And I'm also listening a lot to Hey Insane, Hae Insane. She's a pianist, a Korean American pianist, but it sounds like she attended a Black gospel church all her life.
Wow.
And
Cool.
so she merges that sound with jazz.
Oh, neat. Yeah,
Yeah.
I did not know either of those people. Thank you for those recommendations. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, and you're welcome to come back anytime. Had a good time talking with you here, and I'm sure there'll be more to talk about in this realm. So,
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
great. Have a good rest of your night.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you know.